So something that we found also is that our staff had different levels of comfort in engaging visitors about these topics, or if they saw, say, a visitor who's war whooping in the exhibit. Some staff feel very comfortable with this content knowledge and they feel comfortable addressing a visitor. Others do not feel comfortable doing that. Can you recommend any strategies for people who don't feel comfortable, or for museums to sort of gauge the comfort level of different staff?
I mean, if something is truly unbelievably offensive, I think that you should just address it head on, and you should talk to the parent and say something to the parent that we would like their child not to use that word because it's extremely offensive. There are some things that you have to do. You have to just say it. Professionally, but clearly. And then there's other things that you can say a little softer, and you can sometimes put the blame on yourself, or you can say your advisory group recommended, or you can say we had a Native American educator that came in and they taught us this. And so use sort of some of those segues to help, I call it help people to hear, because if they're attacked, they will hear nothing. And two things will happen. They'll never come back to your museum and they still won't have learned anything. So you're always trying to educate and teach. So always when you have as the person on the floor, and this is not your job 24/7 because there's lots of exhibits in a children's museum that are of different content areas. So you're not always in Native American content is my point. So your staff may feel more insecure because, yes, they're gonna get a little training, and yes, they're gonna have looked at the exhibits and they're gonna have read some things, but they're not spending their life in Native history and culture. So it's very easy to be insecure in how to address these issues. And so as a staff and a team, you've got to decide what things are, it just will be not tolerated. If someone's going to use a racial slur, that's a no tolerance. Someone comes in with a Pocahontas costume, you might want to educate around it, but you might not make a huge deal around it. To the point that it's going to make a child feel uncomfortable to be there, and the parent's like, I didn't bring any other clothes, kind of thing. So you have to kind of pick your battles on where you need to go with each topic area. But when they do the training and you start to have a core group that seems to be comfortable, I think that they really should role play, because the only way that they're going to get comfortable is for someone to be the child or the family, and someone to come upon an issue that feels inappropriate, and how do you deal with that? Personally, I think sometimes just cut to the chase. If they're doing something that's really offensive, you need to just walk up and say to the parent kindly, in our training around this particular exhibit, because of the cultural competencies that are needed in this exhibit, we've learned that is really inappropriate and it's a stereotype that's been perpetuated. We'd really like it if you'd help your child to start doing something, engage in another project so that they won't continue to do that. And just be point blank. For those that are really uncomfortable doing that, I think they should be matched, like paired with someone who's more competent so that they can watch it in action. So that if there's, 4 or 5 staff that are really strong in that exhibit and are able to handle these situations when they come up, but you need other staff to be able to do it as well when they're not there. You might match up a strong with a weaker, I don't like to use those terms, but a more experienced staff member with someone who's new to understanding how to handle these situations together so that they can see it in action. And I think that's really a good strategy around that, along with role playing and the trainings that are happening. You might encourage staff that's feeling less confident not only to review the film once, but maybe a second time to digest it a little bit more, because there's examples and strategies in the handbook for the exhibit, as well as the films and training supports that go with the exhibit. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for them to learn from that. But I would also encourage them, after they've created their Native American advisory on the exhibit, to pose some of these questions for their local community. Because again, I can give you a lovely example, but it's from my perspective. It's from my perspective, from my own home community, but also from my experiences as a teacher. So when I say, oh, just do a teachable moment, they might be, what is she talking about? I have no idea what a teachable moment is, but I've been a teacher for 30 years, so I'm always thinking about what is the teachable moment. You know, when I train the staff in the museum that I work in, I'm always teaching them to look for it. And we also role play scenarios that have come up for other people. For new staff, we kind of jot them down. So when something comes up that someone couldn't handle, they should jot that down and come up with a brainstorming session around what could have been a better way if they didn't handle it at all, and they're like, oh my God, I was in the exhibit and someone was in there and they came in and they had a paper headdress on and they had war paint on their face and I just didn't know what to do. I just froze and I did nothing. Well, the team could be like, you know, what should we do about this? Can we go up to a parent and tell them to take that off? You know, what's our policy going to be around that? You know, it is a children's museum and we encourage play and creativity. You know, but could we mention to a parent that that is considered not best practices in education anymore? If their teachers are still doing it, it's unfortunate, but they shouldn't be. Or, you know, kids do that in birthday parties and things like that, but we've learned through all our training that that's not best today, and that we're encouraging people not to do it because it continues stereotypes and misconceptions about Native culture and the people, and that they still live in the 21st century. You know, sort of spinning it that way is really, really helpful. And I think when you bring the staff back to the conversation and they can be part of sort of problem solving it doesn't put all the problem solving on one person to come up with some scenario. It actually, you can come up with 3 or 4 levels of engagement that might work. And then I really recommend people putting supports on their website.
Something that's come up is, and this is definitely more with, I've found with adults than with children, is people will say things that are maybe knowingly politically incorrect, that you can tell very clearly that they have an intellectual knowledge, like a basic knowledge of what is sort of appropriate and what isn't, and that there's something, I don't know, like that they're going to be like ironically politically incorrect or use particularly broad language because they think it's funny.
Well, you know, in my experience, I find that you have to decide, are you addressing this issue with this person, or are you using that example for everybody else? And the reason why I say that is some people you can't change, and they're not going to listen to you regardless. And so I tend to use the person that's the most absurd, meaning the adults, not the kids, that is the most offensive. I usually use that example for everyone else that I'm teaching to change their perspective. So I can change the masses, but I can't change that one person that's stuck in their ways. I recommend de-escalation. So sometimes you have to ignore and then you address later. And so you come back around. The example that I put in reverse is that sometimes there's people that are non-native that have a lot of knowledge, so much so that they think they have more knowledge about our people than our people. And that can be extremely offensive. And sometimes, you know, I will try to articulate that, yes, you read that in a book, but that doesn't mean that that's the fact, because our community has its own history and its own knowledge around who we are. So sometimes I'm still saying it just straight, but it's easier for me as the person from the community to do that than for your educators to do that, because you're not from that community. So I would recommend redirect and then infusing facts for everybody else somewhere else down the line a little bit more that maybe contradict what they say. And maybe even stating, you know, sometimes people, when they're in an environment where they feel uncomfortable, they'll use humor. But sometimes that humor can be offensive to the community that they're referencing. And so, but not necessarily right directly at that person. Do you see what the difference?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you're wrapping it around. It might be 40 minutes later, but you've come back to that. And hopefully in context based on where you led your conversation to get there, to help people to understand. Because I think people do use humor when they feel awkward, and sometimes that is when they really sort of put their foot in their mouth and they say things that are inappropriate. So that would be sort of my strategy around that.